In the 19th century, a strange tale arose from the easternmost island of the Caribbean. From an otherwise peaceful resting place, evidence emerged that something very unusual was occurring, a phenomenon that has inspired both curiosity and fear in generations of people from the region and beyond. Taken together from nearly 2 centuries of eyewitness testimony, the story's details strongly suggest the impossible, that the dead do not always rest in their graves. How and why this happens continues to defy both the peace of the dead and the logic of the living. You won't want to miss this one. In the early 1700s, a man by the name of James Elliot decided that his family needed a proper resting place. James lived on Barbados, an island on the eastern edge of the Caribbean, and since he served as an official with the island's government, felt that his family's position demanded something a little different to be remembered after death. You see, as in many of the other parts of the region, it was common to bury the dead above ground. Now, there are several reasons for this. For starters, many of the islands have a high water table, leaving burial plots vulnerable to flooding. Flooding opens up the possibility of coffins being pushed to the surface, which is not only a hassle to repair, but also a health hazard. Dead bodies combined with the heat and humidity in this part of the world can quickly lead to outbreaks of disease. Not to mention, it's just downright disgusting. Plus, there is another added benefit to above-ground burial. They require less lawn maintenance. Instead of large fields of burial plots, you wind up with a bunch of stone slabs and mausoleums dotting the landscape. But James wanted something more substantial than a modest above-ground slab. He wanted to not only be able to visit his loved ones, but also wanted to protect the integrity of their remains. For this reason, he set about constructing a modest brick-and-mortar vault in the churchyard of Oyston's Christ Church Parish. Finally, in 1724, the project was completed. A peaceful resting place for James's lineage to overlook the Caribbean Sea, although his family would find no true rest there. The vault consisted of a stone chamber nestled a dozen feet below the surface of Barbados, entered by using a steep set of stairs, and once you reached the bottom, you were greeted by a somewhat narrow space, only about 6 feet wide. Here, coffins were to be placed, heads towards the rear, feet towards the door, until the vault was filled. Until then, each coffin would be placed one on top of another, and the door to the vault sealed. Following each burial, an enormous marble slab was to be slid over the entrance to protect the remains. The seal was heavy enough to discourage anyone interfering with the burials. Now time dragged on, and the vault sat mostly empty, thankfully. People disagree on whether or not James Elliot was ever buried there himself. When he passed away in 1784, some say that his coffin was placed inside, others say that he was buried elsewhere. The first documented internment was his wife, Elizabeth, who passed away on May 14, 1792. Now at this point, you're probably thinking that this story already sounds a little fishy. After all, it should be easy enough to determine where James was buried, right? Well, there's a good reason for this. You see, after her death, ownership of the vault passed through various other families. And so the first family to buy the Elliot vaults were the Warrens. The first burial during their ownership was the body of a woman by the name of Thomasina Goddard in a wooden coffin. But when the Walrond family unsealed the vault for the first time for her burial in 1807, they noticed something odd, folks. It was empty. Neither James Elliot's coffin nor the coffin of his wife Elizabeth were anywhere to be found. Clearly, this could have several explanations, because the vaults had been sold, after all. Maybe the family, or whoever managed their estate, had simply relocated James and Elizabeth, meaning that this is one possible reason why we don't know much about where James was initially buried. But as time went on, people began to entertain stranger ideas. Supernatural ideas, actually. Because the saga of the vaults in Barbados was just beginning. The vault would take its name from the next and final family that owned it, the Chase family. You see, the Walrons sold the vault to another island official, Thomas Chase. When possession of the vault passed into Thomas's hands, he simply left the body of Thomisa Goddard inside rather than making room for his own family. Well, it wasn't long before tragedy struck. On February 22, 1808, shortly after the vault was purchased by the Chase family, their 2-year-old daughter, Mary Ann Maria, passed away. And this time, the coffin makers fashioned a coffin not out of wood, but out of lead. This made the coffin extremely heavy to move, but it also meant that once it was put in the vault, it stayed in place. This was just the first of a series of setbacks for the Chase family, and they would have to endure. Only 4 years later, Thomas Chase's other daughter, who was 12, passed away as well. And so rumors began swirling around that it was Thomas who had murdered them, that he was a cruel man, and he was a slaveholder and had a reputation for being especially brutal both to his slaves and his family. Some said that Thomas murdered his daughter. Others said that she had been starved to death, either by her father or by her own free will, as a sign of solidarity with the men and women who suffered from his cruelty. But in any case, in 1812, another lead coffin was made for Thomas's second dead daughter. Again, there was a funeral, and again the massive slab covering the vault was slid aside, so heavy it required several men to move it. But a bizarre sight awaited them inside, folks. There, opposite from the corner in which it had been placed 4 years earlier, was the tiny coffin of Mary Ann Maria Chase. Not only was it all the way across the room, but it was upside down. Now remember, while Mary Ann's body didn't weigh that much, this was a heavy lead coffin we're talking about. Natural forces simply don't seem capable of disturbing the remains in such a dramatic manner. And there was no sign that anyone had tampered with the marble slab covering the entrance. After all, it could only be moved deliberately with great effort from several strong men. Not knowing what to do, the Chase family simply hauled in Dorcas' coffin, his 12-year-old daughter, and then replaced the coffin of Mary Ann on top of her sister. You can see the arrangement here, along with the later burials we'll be covering. Now, needless to say, the death of 2 children in such a short span of time took its toll on the Chase family, as it would with any sane human being. Within about a month, Thomas Chase was officially dead. Some say that he died from natural causes, others said that it was the grief alone that killed him. Still, others swore that Thomas took his own life, but whatever the circumstances, Thomas Chase was laid to rest in late 1812. And the process repeated itself as it had for the family twice before. A lead coffin was made, a funeral held, and the vault unsealed. The burial chamber let loose a blast of stale air, like the foul breath of some massive subterranean beast. Everyone looked inside as the first golden rays of the Barbados sun crossed the threshold, and everyone gasped. The 3 coffins were scattered around the small room. Just a few months earlier, the vault had been neatly arranged in rows and stacks, and now it was as if someone had shaken the entire Chase vault, sending the heavy lead coffins into an awkward arrangement, some ends on the floor, the other ends popped up by the other coffins. It simply made no sense. As before, the funeral party pitched in and rearranged the coffins again, adding Thomas Chase to the burials. The marble slab was slid across the entrance and resealed with cement. Although the events caused quite a stir in the community for quite some time, the demands of living on an isolated island soon took over, and people more or less stopped talking about the mysterious moving coffins of the Chase vaults. Now, over the next 4 years, the Chase Vault saga became a little more than a passing curiosity. That was until 1816. That year, An infant related to the Chase family, 11-month-old Samuel Brewster, passed away, and a tiny lead coffin was made to hold his body. When the time came to place the child in his resting place in September, well, you know how the story goes by now. The coffins were in as much disarray as they had ever been. The stacks and rows were obliterated, as if someone with enormous strength had just come in and overturned everything. Some people remarked that it was almost like the coffins had been dancing. Then, as the vault was opened, simply tumbled to the ground where they had stood. Folks, I want you guys to remember that Thomasina Goddard's coffin was the only one in this place that was wood. Every other coffin was made out of lead. Do you know how heavy lead is? I mean, it's said that the adult-sized coffins took 8 men alone to move into the Chase vaults, rather than the standard 6 pallbearers seen in modern funerals. I mean, these coffins could only move if a massive force was put in place. As to what that force might have been, well, we'll discuss that soon. But this time, everybody was talking about the Chase vaults. It left everyone baffled and, quite frankly, pretty scared. Was something supernatural occurring? We don't know. There wasn't any apparent explanation for the state that the coffins were always found in. Now, eventually, General James Edward Alexander would pen a memoir entitled Transatlantic Sketches, where he discussed the saga of the Chase vaults in 1833. He described the general sense that everyone had each time the Chase vault was reopened, writing,
"Each time the vault was opened, the coffins were replaced in their proper situations. That is, 3 on the ground side by side and the others laid on them. The vault was then regularly closed. The door, a massive stone which required 6 or 7 men to move, was cemented by masons, and though the floor was of sand, there were no marks of footsteps or water."
Not long passed before the vault was opened yet again, and a few months later, an especially violent slave rebellion resulted in numerous deaths across the island, including the infant's father, a man who shared the name Samuel Brewster. The elder Samuel was placed inside the Chase vault on November 16, 1816. It was exactly the same as before. Coffins tossed everywhere, the entire room a jumble of lead boxes. You kind of have to admire the family and the way that they would put the bodies back in order after every funeral. I mean, it must have felt pretty hopeless, knowing that things would be found a mess again at the next burial. But by now, the moving coffins of the Chase vault had attracted the attention of other authorities on the island. They wanted to get to the bottom of the mystery once and for all. In fact, the saga even attracted the attention of Lord Combermere, Sir Stapleton Cotton, the government of Barbados, and he planned to be present for the next burial. Well, their opportunity came 3 years later. The next body to be placed in the vault was that of Thomasina Clark. Unlike the other burials in the Chase vaults, her coffin was made of wood instead of lead, and so the masonry was chipped away from the entrance and her coffin carried downstairs. General James Edward Alexander described the scene. He wrote,
"The last time the vault was opened was in 1819. Lord Combermere was then present, and the coffins were found confusedly thrown around the vault. Some with their heads down and others up. What could have occasioned this phenomenon? In no other vault in the island has this ever occurred. Was it an earthquake which occasioned it, or the effects of inundation in the vault?"
With no apparent answer for the disturbed coffins, an official inquiry was launched. A variety of theories were all raised. The first, as mentioned in General Alexander's book, was that the earthquakes were to blame. Like a lot of places, Barbados has seen its share of earthquakes over the years, but during the time frame that the coffins were found disturbed, Barbados was actually seismically quiet. In fact, between the years of 1812 and 1820, there is no record of any significant earthquakes on the island at all. The next likely explanation was flooding. Remember, many if not most Caribbean cemeteries and graveyards feature burials above ground for this very reason. It seems logical enough though, water poured into the vaults, lifting up the coffins and floating them around the chamber, right? And when the flood waters receded, the coffins were left in new positions. Well, there are a couple of problems with this idea. These were coffins made of lead, not wood, and less likely to float, if at all. Plus, the Chase vault sits much higher than the water table, and the surrounding bedrock is porous, meaning that any water in the vault would likely have quickly drained into the ground before really accumulating very much, if at all. And because of this, flooding in the Chase vault is actually pretty unlikely, and even if it did flood, it probably wouldn't have gotten substantial enough to rearrange the coffins. Taken together, natural causes seem unlikely, so what about human causes? This was one of the more popular theories about the vault, that someone had broken into the chamber and vandalized the coffins. But remember, this doesn't make a lot of sense because, after all, while the coffins were clearly moved, none of them were opened. The remains were left undisturbed. And that means that no belongings were taken from the bodies, so we clearly aren't dealing with grave robbers. But what if the people who entered the tomb weren't grave robbers? What if they were just protesting? I mean, during this time, the Chase family were slaveholders, and Barbados had a lot of civil strife at the time, including rebellions where slaves rose up to challenge their oppressors. Now today, many people assume that this vault was the target of vandals, perhaps wanting to desecrate the remains of slaveholders and their families. And this does make sense until you consider a handful of factors. Again, the bodies were left untouched, but even if that wasn't the case, how did anyone enter in the first place? I mean, at least after a few times that the coffins moved, the entrance was cemented shut. This led some people to suspect that a hidden tunnel or secret passageway had been built to access the vault from underground. But a thorough search of the burial chamber by authorities revealed no such entrance. Now, faced with these confusing facts, a number of voices weighed in on alternative explanations. The most common was that the disturbances at this vault were the result of supernatural phenomena. Poltergeists are known for moving objects during hauntings, after all, and it makes sense that a noisy ghost could move a few coffins too. The most prominent figure to offer his opinion on the vault was none other than an author and paranormal enthusiast, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In his words, Doyle said that the vault incident was undoubtedly true and cannot be met by any of the indigenous explanations of the honest but skeptical researcher. Among other things, Doyle went on to suggest that the spirits of Thomas and Dorcas Chase, both of whom, you might remember, seem to have taken their own lives, that they were restless. Perhaps they, after their deaths, had caused the coffins to move. But there was odd activity in this vault long before either Thomas or his 12-year-old daughter Dorcas died. Not only had other coffins moved, but there was also the odd absence of James and Elizabeth Elliot's bodies when the Walron family first bought the vault long before the Chase family did. If not the Chases themselves, then maybe something older was disturbing coffins in the vaults. Perhaps an ancient spirit existing since long before the island was colonized. Still, it remained on Barbados and was expressing its dissatisfaction in outsiders violating its sacred landscape. I mean, after all, this was apparently not the first time that coffins moving on their own in a burial vault had ever been reported. Elsewhere in the world, rumors of similar things had spread far and wide. A September 1815 magazine article titled "The Curious Vault at Stanton in Suffolk" described another set of moving coffins in England. The article said,
"On opening the vault some years since, several leaden coffins with wooden cases that had been fixed on briars were found displaced to the great astonishment of many. They were placed as before when some time ago another of the family dying, they were a second time found displaced. 2 years after, they were found not only all off the briars, but one coffin as heavy as to require 8 men to raise it was found on the 4th step that leads into the vault."
Now, this sounds strikingly similar to the case in Barbados happening around the same time. Another tale shared by an F.A. Paley on November 9th, 1867, describes the same thing happening elsewhere in England. Paley wrote,
"Some 20 years ago, in the parish of Gretford, near Stamford, my father was the rector. Twice, if not thrice, the coffins in a vault were found on the opening to have been disarranged. The matter excited some interest in the village at the time, and of course was a fertile theme for popular superstition. But I think it was hushed up out of respect to the family to whom the vault belonged."
Clearly, moving coffins were found in other places during the 19th century. Were the events at the Chase Vault in Barbados just one example among many in a worldwide outbreak of moving coffins? Well, a lot of speculation swirled around the circumstances surrounding the vault. None of these answers satisfied the curiosity of Governor Cotton. Determined to get to the bottom of things, he prepared to capture hard evidence of whoever was getting into the vault. So he ordered buckets of sand to be brought in and spread evenly across the stone floor of the burial chamber, in the hope that any intruders would clearly leave behind footprints. The governor also ordered that the slab be sealed with cement to rule out the possibility of anybody tampering with the masonry, and ordered that several government officials place their seal upon the cement. The governor added his own seal as well, and now it would be easy to tell if someone had chipped away the cement and replaced it, because the seals would be broken. Well, after a few months, it was deemed that enough time had passed that investigation could proceed. On April 18, 1820, the Chase Vault was unsealed. Everything on the outside was just as it should have been. None of the masonry was disturbed, and all the official government seals were left intact. The officials set to work chipping away the cement, and once that was finished, 7 or so men started the exhausting process of sliding aside the marble slab. Everyone present held their breath, unsure of what to expect. Now, at first, it seemed like the mystery had been solved. Just inside the entrance, the sand looked smooth and undisturbed, as peaceful as the day that it had been spread across the floor. There were no footprints, nor were there any scuff marks where someone might have covered their tracks. But there was a problem. One by one, the authorities descended the staircase and saw this. On the left, you can see how the coffins were arranged when the governor and other authorities resealing the tomb in 1819. On the right is how they found them in 1820, after all the precautions they had put in place. No one could explain, after all the care with which the vault had been prepared, how this could even happen. It defied all logic, folks, and for the first and only time, there was an additional clue. A bit of Mary Ann Maria Chase's lead coffin had been chipped. This suggested that the toddler's coffin had not been gently pushed into place, but rather that it had been picked up and thrown forcefully against one of the walls. Everybody was stumped. As for the Chase family, they simply had enough. All of the coffins were moved to another location, and for the first time since the Elliot family was buried there, the vault sat empty, and it has continued to sit empty ever since. In 2 centuries since it was abandoned, the Chase Vault has become something of an iconic story among paranormal investigators. I mean, it stands as a well-documented case of genuinely anomalous phenomena beyond the capacity of human beings to understand. At the same time, predictably enough, it has also attracted a lot of attention from skeptics. The most prominent of these is Benjamin Radford. Benjamin correctly points out that there is a lot of conflicting information about this vault. Some retellings contradict themselves, and we have yet to track down any mention of the incident from contemporary sources in Barbados. Now, on top of that, he also examined the inside of the vault in 2011 and found no evidence that any of the bricks inside showed damage from the lead coffins being thrown around the chamber. Another prominent skeptic, Joe Nickel, believes that the Chase vaults may actually be of all things, a hoax spread by the Freemasons. For example, Joe pointed out that one passage from a retelling of the Chase Vault story that seems to encode Masonic symbolism of a secret vault. The passage was written by Nathan Lucas, one of the witnesses present when the governor unsealed the Chase Vault in April of 1820. In the passage, Nathan wrote, "I examined the walls, the arch, and every part of the vault and found every part old and similar, and a mason in my presence struck every part of the bottom with his hammer, and all was solid." Now, Joe explained the Masonic symbolism in the simplest statement. He wrote,
"In the Royal Arch degree of Masonry, to which the arch above may have been in cryptic reference, there is a reference to the sound of a hammer. According to Masonic lore, the blow of the master's hammer commands industry, silence, and/or the close of labor, and every brother respects or honors its sound."
Now, Joe went on to explain how the Masonic Royal Arch Decree says that we have examined the secret vaults, a literal summary of what the Chase Vault investigator says in the statement from earlier, that plus the fact that it deliberately references a mason in my presence. And it was enough for Joe Nickell to write off the Chase Vault story as a symbolic retelling of old ideas from Freemasonry. So, who knows? Was it all just a tall tale encoded with symbolism from one of the world's most mysterious secret societies? Or did something truly unusual happen on the small island in the easternmost border of the Caribbean Sea? If so, was it the result of something natural, like an earthquake or a flood? Or was it something much stranger, something supernatural? Could the spirits of the dead really express their dissatisfaction by moving their coffins around while no one is looking? Even now, over 200 years after the Chase Vault was abandoned, we seem no closer to any answer. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below, give me death or give me coffins. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange stories and cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. And as always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.